The morning of October 25, 1944, broke over the Philippine Sea with the kind of deceptive tranquility that often precedes catastrophe. Ensign William Brooks sat in the cockpit of his Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber, flying at 1,500 feet through air that tasted of salt and carried the faint metallic scent that always seemed to hover over these tropical waters. His hands rested lightly on the controls as he scanned the grey expanse below, searching for the dark shapes of submarines that might threaten the small escort carriers of Task Unit 77.4.3. The routine patrol had launched from USS St. Lo just minutes earlier, and Brooks expected nothing more eventful than another monotonous circuit over empty ocean before returning to the carrier for breakfast. Then he saw them. At first, Brooks thought his eyes were playing tricks on him in the uncertain light of early dawn. Dark shapes materialized from the northern horizon, cutting through patches of morning mist that clung to the water's surface. He squinted through his binoculars, adjusting the focus with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy. What he saw made no sense whatsoever. Those distinctive pagoda-style superstructures could only mean one thing, but that thing was impossible. The Japanese fleet was supposed to be somewhere else entirely, blocked by American battleships guarding the San Bernardino Strait. Yet here they came, an entire armada steaming at high speed directly toward the 6 small escort carriers that had nothing remotely capable of stopping such overwhelming force. Brooks keyed his radio with hands that trembled slightly, despite his best efforts to remain calm. His voice carried across the airwaves to every ship in the task unit, words that would freeze the blood of every man who heard them. Those ships bearing 240 degrees were not friendly forces. He counted methodically, his training taking over even as his mind struggled to process what his eyes reported. 4 battleships, their massive bulk unmistakable even at this distance. 7 cruisers, heavy by their size and the way they cut through the water. 11 destroyers screening the larger ships, all of them heading directly toward Task Unit 77.4.3 at speeds that could only mean hostile intent. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague received the initial sighting report on the flag bridge of USS Fanshawe Bay with reflexive disbelief. Some young aviator had obviously misidentified friendly ships, probably part of Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet that everyone knew was protecting their northern flank. Sprague muttered something about screwy young pilots to his staff officers and ordered Brooks to verify his identification before causing unnecessary panic. 3 minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Then Brooks's voice crackled over the radio again, and this time there could be no mistake. He could see pagoda masts rising from the sea. He could see the largest battleship he had ever witnessed, flying the biggest Japanese naval ensign imaginable. The enemy fleet was real, it was close, and it was coming fast. The mathematics of the situation became clear with horrible precision. Sprague commanded 6 Casablanca-class escort carriers, each displacing approximately 7,800 tons. These ships had been built on merchant hulls at Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, designed for the unglamorous work of providing air support to troops ashore and hunting submarines. Their maximum speed was 18 knots, barely faster than the cargo vessels from which they were converted. Their armament consisted of a single 5-inch gun mounted on the stern and numerous light anti-aircraft weapons. Their aircraft carried bombs and rockets meant for Japanese bunkers and trucks, not armor-piercing weapons capable of damaging heavy warships. His screen consisted of 3 Fletcher-class destroyers and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts, collectively known as the Small Boys. These ships packed 5-inch guns and torpedoes, but they were designed for convoy escort and submarine hunting, not surface combat against battleships whose armor belts were thicker than the destroyer escort's entire hulls. Against this modest force came the full might of the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force. The super battleship Yamato led the formation, a floating fortress displacing 72,800 tons and mounting 9 18.1-inch guns. Each of those massive weapons could hurl a 3,220-pound armor-piercing shell over 26 miles with devastating accuracy. Her main battery alone could deliver more destructive power in a single salvo than all of Sprague's ships combined could generate in 5 minutes of sustained fire. Battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna added their 14-inch and 16-inch guns to the formation. 6 heavy cruisers provided devastating mid-range firepower, each mounting 8 or 10 8-inch guns specifically designed to gut lightly armored targets like escort carriers. Light cruisers and destroyers completed a force that outweighed Sprague's entire command by approximately 10-1. The road leading to this impossible confrontation had been paved months earlier as American forces advanced relentlessly across the Pacific. By October 1944, the liberation of the Philippines had become strategically inevitable and operationally imminent. American troops invaded Leyte Island on October 20th, establishing a foothold that threatened to sever Japan's maritime lifelines to the south. Without oil from the Dutch East Indies and rubber from Southeast Asia flowing northward, the Japanese war machine would strangle within months. The Imperial Japanese Navy understood this existential threat with perfect clarity. They devised Operation Shogo-1, a complex 3-pronged attack designed to destroy the American invasion fleet anchored in Leyte Gulf through simultaneous convergence from 3 different directions. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would lead the northern force southward from Japan with 4 aircraft carriers. These flat tops were shells of their former power, embarking barely 100 aircraft total with pilots so inexperienced many could barely land on carrier decks. This force existed solely as bait to lure Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf. Ozawa understood his mission was sacrificial, his carriers expendable if their destruction drew Halsey northward, while the real killing blow came from elsewhere. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would bring the southern force northward through Surigao Strait with 2 battleships, a heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers to strike the invasion fleet from below. And Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would command the center force through San Bernardino Strait to deliver the decisive blow against vulnerable transport ships in Leyte Gulf. American submarines had begun unraveling this plan before it fully deployed. On October 23rd, USS Data and USS Dace patrolled the Palawan Passage west of the Philippines when their sonar operators detected Kurita's force transiting eastward. At dawn, they struck with coordinated torpedo attacks. Data's weapons slammed into heavy cruiser Atago, Kurita's flagship, tearing the massive vessel apart. Atago sank in 18 minutes, taking 360 men with her. Kurita found himself swimming for his life in shark-infested waters before being rescued by a destroyer. The psychological impact of nearly drowning while his command exploded around him would haunt his decision-making 48 hours later. Data's second spread crippled heavy cruiser Takao, forcing her to limp back to Brunei escorted by 2 destroyers. Dace torpedoed heavy cruiser Maya, which exploded and sank in minutes. In 1 hour, American submarines had sunk 2 heavy cruisers, crippled a third, and nearly killed the Japanese commander. Kurita transferred his flag to Yamato and pressed eastward despite these losses. The plan required his arrival at Leyte Gulf at dawn on October 25th, and there was no time to reorganize or reconsider. The following day brought fresh catastrophe when American carrier aircraft from Halsey's Third Fleet located Kurita's force transiting the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked throughout the afternoon. Super battleship Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, became the focus of American assault. Over 4 hours, she absorbed punishment that would have sunk any other warship afloat. American pilots reported hitting her with 19 torpedoes and 17 bomb hits. At 19:35 on October 24th, Musashi capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 of her crew to the bottom. Yamato would arrive off Samar the next morning without her sister beside her. Kurita's force took such punishment in the Sibuyan Sea that he temporarily reversed course westward around 1500 hours, appearing to retreat. American pilots reported the center force heavily damaged and retiring from battle. Admiral Halsey, reading these reports aboard his flagship USS New Jersey, made the fateful decision that would leave Leyte Gulf's northern flank exposed. That evening, Halsey received reports of Ozawa's carrier force approaching from the north. The bait proved irresistible. Carriers represented the decisive weapon of Pacific naval warfare, the instruments that had won at Coral Sea and Midway. A chance to destroy the remnants of Japan's carrier force could not be ignored. Halsey took his entire Third Fleet northward, all 6 fast battleships, all 8 fleet carriers, all cruisers and destroyers. He left absolutely nothing to guard San Bernardino Strait. More critically, Halsey failed to clearly communicate this decision to Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, commander of the 7th Fleet responsible for protecting the Leyte invasion. Halsey had sent a preparatory dispatch about forming Task Force 34, a powerful battleship group under Admiral Willis Lee, to guard the strait. But this was merely a contingency plan, not an executed order. Through a series of miscommunications and assumptions, Kinkaid believed Task Force 34 had been detached and was guarding San Bernardino Strait. Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor read the same dispatches and made the same assumption. No such force existed. The San Bernardino Strait lay completely unguarded, a highway wide open for Japanese warships to steam through unopposed. Kurita, having reorganized his battered force after Musashi's loss, reversed course again after nightfall and steamed eastward with renewed determination. At 12:35 on the morning of October 25th, his force passed through San Bernardino Strait without opposition. Not a single American ship or aircraft observed the passage. The center force had been reduced but remained formidable beyond anything the escort carriers could hope to stop. 4 battleships led by Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers headed south along the eastern coast of Samar Island toward completely undefended American landing beaches. Between Kurita's overwhelming firepower and General Douglas MacArthur's 130,000 vulnerable troops ashore stood only 3 small task units of escort carriers designated by radio call signs Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3. Taffy 3, the northernmost unit positioned closest to San Bernardino Strait, was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, known as Ziggy, to distinguish him from another Rear Admiral Sprague commanding Taffy 1 90 miles to the south. The 48-year-old career officer now faced the most critical 60 seconds of his life. His force consisted of 6 escort carriers totaling approximately 50,000 tons combined displacement. USS Fanshawe Bay served as flagship. USS St. Lo, USS White Plains, USS Kalinin Bay, USS Kitkun Bay, and USS Gambia Bay completed the carrier contingent. Each embarked approximately 28 aircraft, divided between FM-2 Wildcat fighters and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Total aircraft strength numbered approximately 165 planes, equivalent to 2 fleet carriers, but with pilots trained primarily for ground support missions rather than naval combat. Screening these carriers were 7 small warships. 3 Fletcher-class destroyers provided the heavier punch. USS Johnston, USS Hole, and USS Heermann each displaced 2,100 tons fully loaded and carried 5 single 5-inch guns in enclosed turrets. These weapons fired 54-pound shells to ranges of 18,000 yards under ideal conditions, though effective range against moving targets was considerably less. Their main anti-ship weapons were 10 21-inch torpedo tubes in 2 quintuple mounts, carrying torpedoes with 825-pound warheads and ranges of 10,000 yards. 4 John Butler-class destroyer escorts completed the screen. USS Samuel Roberts, USS Dennis, USS John Butler, and USS Raymond displaced only 1,350 tons each and mounted just 2 5-inch guns without the sophisticated fire control systems of the larger destroyers. They carried 3 torpedo tubes, adequate for anti-submarine work but minimal for surface combat against battleships. At 6:37 on the morning of October 25th, when Ensign Brooks transmitted his sighting report, Sprague faced an impossible tactical situation with no good options whatsoever. His carriers could not outrun the Japanese force. Even coaxing 19 knots from engines designed for 18, the carriers would be overtaken within 2 hours. His 5-inch guns could not penetrate battleship or cruiser armor at any range. His aircraft were armed for ground support missions with general-purpose bombs and rockets, not armor-piercing bombs or torpedoes designed for naval combat. Most torpedo bombers had already expended their aerial torpedoes on dawn strikes against shore targets. The nearest American heavy ships capable of challenging Kurita belonged to Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's bombardment group 90 miles to the south, and those battleships had just finished annihilating the Japanese southern force in a night battle at Surigao Strait, depleting most of their armor-piercing ammunition in the process. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet was 300 miles to the north pursuing Ozawa's carriers. Even if recalled immediately, Halsey's battleships needed 6 hours to reach Samar. Sprague had perhaps 15 minutes before Japanese shells found their range and began systematically destroying his carriers. Yet in those minutes, he formulated a response that would become a masterclass in naval tactics against overwhelming odds. First, he ordered all carriers to launch every available aircraft immediately. Pilots scrambled to their planes still wearing pajamas or shorts, engines turning over before pre-flight checks were complete, planes roaring off carrier decks armed with whatever ordnance happened to be loaded. Some carried depth charges meant for submarines. Others carried general-purpose bombs for shore bombardment. Some launched with empty wings, their pilots intending to make dry runs to distract Japanese gunners. Second, Sprague turned his formation east-southeast toward a rain squall his radar operator had spotted 5 miles ahead. The weather would partially mask his ships and buy precious minutes. Third, he ordered maximum speed from his carriers, engineering crews pushing boilers beyond their design limits. Fourth, he commanded his escorts to generate smoke, the destroyers and destroyer escorts carrying chemical smoke generators that could produce thick artificial fog to obscure visibility. At 6:45, lookouts on the escort carriers spotted anti-aircraft bursts on the northwestern horizon as Japanese ships engaged Brooks's lone Avenger. Moments later, coloured splashes began erupting around the carriers as Japanese ships opened fire. The Japanese used different coloured dyes in their shells to allow spotters to identify which ship was scoring hits. Red, green, yellow and blue splashes began walking toward the American carriers, creating a deadly rainbow advancing across the water. The brilliant hues created beautiful but terrifying fountains as shells weighing hundreds of pounds detonated on impact with the sea. At 6:46, Yamato fired her first salvo from maximum range. The 9 18.1-inch guns hurled 9 tons of steel and explosive toward the small American carriers. Sprague broadcast in the clear, violating normal radio security, a message that would trigger immediate panic in multiple headquarters across the Philippines. He requested immediate assistance from any ships or aircraft capable of providing it, his transmission received by every American naval unit in theater. Admiral Kincaid, still engaged with remnants of the Southern force, realized with horror that no American heavy ships protected the northern approach. Admiral Halsey, 300 miles north engaging Ozawa's carriers, received Sprague's call with equal horror. But relief would take hours to arrive. Taffy 3 had only minutes. At 7:01, the first Japanese salvos began landing among the carriers. The scale of incoming fire defied comprehension for men who had spent the war providing close air support and hunting submarines. Yamato's shells weighed more than compact automobiles. Heavy cruiser 8-inch guns fired 260-pound shells designed specifically to gut unarmored targets like escort carriers. Against this onslaught, the carriers' thin steel hulls offered no protection whatsoever. A single large-caliber hit could gut an escort carrier from stem to stern. Multiple hits would sink one within minutes. Sprague's ships zigzagged frantically, using a tactic called chasing splashes. Officers directing the ship's maneuvers watched where shells landed and immediately steered toward those spots, gambling that Japanese gunners would not fire twice at the same location. This desperate improvisation actually worked more often than not. Japanese gunners, trained to lead targets moving in straight lines, struggled to adjust for American ships constantly changing course toward their previous shell impacts. But some found their marks. White planes took a direct hit that fortunately failed to explode, the armor-piercing shell passing completely through her thin hull and out the other side without detonating. Kalinin Bay was straddled repeatedly, near misses sending geysers of water cascading across her flight deck and jamming her rudder temporarily. The rain squall provided temporary reprieve at 7:06. For 10 precious minutes, Taffy 3 steamed through torrential rain that reduced visibility to less than 1,000 yards. Japanese guns fell temporarily silent, unable to see their targets through the deluge. Officers and crew used those minutes to organize damage control parties, prepare abandoned ship stations, and say prayers. Many men believed they would not survive the next hour, but they remained at their stations determined to sell their lives dearly. As Taffy 3 emerged from the squall at 7:16, the tactical situation had worsened dramatically. Kurita's force, faster than the American carriers, had closed the range by several miles during the chase. Colored splashes now erupted all around the carriers with frightening accuracy. Near misses sent shrapnel sleeting across flight decks. Direct hits were inevitable within minutes. Sprague made the decision that would define the battle and save his carriers. At 7:16, he ordered the destroyers to conduct a torpedo attack against the Japanese force. Without waiting for detailed instructions, Commander Ernest Evans of USS Johnston had already charged toward the enemy. Evans was Cherokee and Creek Indian from Oklahoma, proud of his heritage and fearless to the point of recklessness in combat. His features reflected his Native American ancestry, earning him the nickname Chief among his crew, though never to his face. At Johnston's commissioning ceremony on October 27, 1943, exactly 1 year and 2 days before the Battle off Samar, Evans had addressed his assembled crew with words that became legendary. "This is going to be a fighting ship," he declared. "I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Not a single sailor requested transfer. Evans had spent the intervening year training Johnston to an edge so sharp that his crew could execute complex maneuvers by instinct. At 7:10, 6 minutes before receiving Sprague's order, Evans had independently turned Johnston northward and begun his attack run. He pointed his ship toward the heart of the Japanese formation and ordered flank speed. Johnston's turbines screamed as she accelerated past 35 knots, racing toward ships that outweighed her 50-1. The range when Johnston began her run was approximately 35,000 yards, over 17 nautical miles. Her torpedoes had an effective range of 10,000 yards, just under 6 miles. To launch, Evans would have to penetrate to point-blank range in naval terms, closing through 17 miles of heavy gunfire from dozens of enemy weapons. Johnston's crew laid chemical smoke as she charged, generating thick artificial fog that partially obscured her from Japanese optical rangefinders. But smoke could not stop shells. At 7:07, Johnston engaged Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano with her 5-inch guns at maximum range. The Mark 37 fire control director, linked to a computer, gave American destroyers devastating advantage in gunnery accuracy. While Japanese optical rangefinders struggled with smoke, rain, and rapidly changing ranges, Johnston's radar painted perfect firing solutions continuously updated in real time. Johnston's shells began hitting Kumano repeatedly. The American destroyer's 54-pound projectiles could not penetrate the cruiser's armored belt, 4 to 5 inches of hardened steel protecting her vitals, but they could devastate her superstructure and upper works, where thinner armor and numerous flammable materials created vulnerabilities. Over the next 10 minutes, Johnston fired over 200 main battery rounds at Kumano, an astonishing rate of fire maintained through superbly trained gun crews working in perfect coordination. At least 45 shells struck the heavy cruiser, starting multiple fires and devastating her bridge and fire control stations. Kumano's topside became hell of exploding shells and burning metal. Her communications were severed, her fire control disrupted. Though her engines remained functional and her main battery intact, Kumano's ability to fight effectively was severely degraded. At 7:20, having closed to 10,300 yards, Evans launched Johnston's entire spread of 10 torpedoes. The weapons streaked through the water, leaving phosphorescent wakes pointing directly back at their launcher. One torpedo, possibly two, slammed into Kumano's bow. The explosions tore off the entire front section of the cruiser from the bow to the forward turret. Kumano's speed dropped immediately to 8 knots as water flooded her forward compartments. She turned away from battle, escorted by heavy cruiser Suzuya detailed to protect the crippled ship, removing 2 major Japanese units from the fight at the critical opening phase. Johnston had accomplished what seemed impossible. A 2,100-ton destroyer had crippled a 13,000-ton heavy cruiser armed with 10 8-inch guns, each of which individually outweighed Johnston's entire main battery. But victory came at terrible and immediate price. At 7:30, as Johnston turned to hide in her own smoke, Yamato fired a full 9-gun salvo at what her fire control station had identified as an American light cruiser. The Japanese had mistaken Johnston for a much larger ship based on her aggressive attack and the heavy damage she had inflicted on Kumano. From 20,300 yards away, over 9 nautical miles, Yamato's optical rangefinders acquired Johnston with deadly accuracy. 3 18.1-inch shells struck Johnston almost simultaneously. The first hit below the waterline aft, penetrating the destroyer's unarmored hull as easily as a rifle bullet through paper. The explosion tore into the after-engine room, rupturing steam lines and flooding compartments. Scalding steam erupted as 600-degree pressurized vapor flashed seawater into more steam. Men in the engine room died instantly, either killed by the explosion or boiled alive by escaping steam. The second shell struck amidships, destroying Johnston's aft engine completely and severing power to the rear half of the ship. Her speed dropped from 35 knots to 17 knots instantly. The third shell hit 2/3 down the ship, severing electrical power to 3 of her 5 5-inch gun turrets, leaving only the 2 forward mounts operational. Each 18.1-inch projectile carried explosive force beyond comprehension for those who had never experienced battleship fire. The shells weighed 3,220 pounds each and contained 73 pounds of explosive. They were designed to penetrate 16 inches of armor plate at 20 miles before detonating inside enemy battleships. Against Johnston's unarmored hull, they punched completely through the thin steel plating before their delayed action fuses triggered detonation. This over-penetration actually saved Johnston from immediate destruction. Had the shells detonated on impact, they would have blown the destroyer in half. But even over-penetrating, the damage was catastrophic. Yamato's secondary battery of 6.1-inch guns fired simultaneously with the main battery. 3 shells slammed into Johnston's superstructure with devastating effect. One hit amidships, destroying an anti-aircraft fire director and killing its crew. 2 more struck forward, obliterating the torpedo director and tearing apart the bridge. The bridge became a slaughterhouse of steel splinters and body parts. Commander Evans was blown off his feet by the blast, 2 fingers of his left hand severed by a steel fragment, his uniform shirt literally torn off his body by concussion. His chest and face were peppered with small steel fragments. Much of his bridge crew was killed instantly. The navigator lost part of his left hand to shrapnel. The helmsman was wounded but maintained his station, keeping the ship under control through instinct and training. Blood covered every surface on what remained of the bridge. With power lost to 3 main gun turrets, steering control severed, engines crippled and half his bridge crew dead or wounded, Johnston should have been finished. Standard naval doctrine dictated that a destroyer suffering such damage should retreat immediately or face certain destruction. But Evans was not a standard officer, and Johnston's crew was not a standard crew. Damage control parties worked with desperate efficiency, learned through endless training drills. Within 10 minutes, they had restored electrical power to the 2 forward gun turrets through emergency cables. They re-established steering control to the emergency station on the fantail. Evans, despite severe wounds and significant blood loss, refused medical treatment beyond minimal field dressing to stop the bleeding. He ordered the ship's doctor to save all medical supplies for wounded crew who needed it more than he did. Evans relocated his command from the shattered bridge to the fantail, where manual steering was now being conducted. He shouted steering orders through an open hatch to sailors manually turning the rudder by hand, cranking the heavy mechanism that normally operated through hydraulic power. Johnston was still in the fight. Reduced to 17 knots with 3 of 5 guns out of action, with half her crew dead or wounded, she remained combat effective through sheer determination of her crew and leadership of a captain who refused to quit. Over the next 2 hours, Johnston would continue fighting, engaging target after target, until Japanese shells finally sent her to the bottom. At this critical moment, USS Hoel and USS Heermann began their own torpedo runs, followed shortly by the 4 destroyer escorts. The converging attacks created chaos in the Japanese formation. Kurita's ships had been steaming in a cruising formation optimized for speed and mutual support, not for maneuvering combat. The aggressive American attacks forced them to maneuver independently to avoid torpedoes, breaking up their coordinated fire plans and creating confusion in command and control. USS Hoel, commanded by Commander Leon Kintberger, charged directly toward the Japanese battleships in the center of their formation. At 7:43, she launched a half salvo of 5 torpedoes at battleship Congo from 9,000 yards. The battleship turned hard to starboard to avoid the spread, combing the torpedoes by presenting her narrow bow and allowing the weapons to pass harmlessly down her length. But the maneuver forced Congo to cease firing temporarily and took her out of position in the formation. At 7:54, Hoel fired her remaining 5 torpedoes at heavy cruiser Haguro from under 6,000 yards, terrifyingly close in naval combat terms. At least 1 torpedo struck Haguro in her engineering spaces, causing flooding and forcing the cruiser to reduce speed for damage control. But Hoel paid a terrible price for her audacity. Japanese shells began hammering the destroyer as she made her approach. Over the next 45 minutes, Hoel absorbed over 40 major caliber hits from battleship and cruiser guns. Her bridge was destroyed by an 8-inch shell that killed most of the officers stationed there. Her forward engine room flooded from hits below the waterline. Her number 2 gun mount was blown off the ship. All power was lost when her remaining engine room flooded. At 8:30, with his ship dead in the water, listing heavily and sinking, Commander Kintberger ordered abandon ship. Hoel rolled over onto her port side and sank stern first at 8:55. Of her crew of 273 officers and men, only 86 survived. 187 died, either killed by shell hits, drowned when the ship sank, or taken by sharks during the 2 days survivors spent in the water awaiting rescue. USS Heermann, commanded by Commander Amos Hathaway, executed perhaps the most daring single maneuver of the entire battle. At 7:54, she launched her full spread of torpedoes at battleship Haruna from 4,400 yards, less than 2.5 miles. The torpedoes missed as Haruna turned hard to avoid, but the battleship was forced to turn away from the carriers, taking her temporarily out of effective gun range. Moments later, Heermann found herself trapped between 2 columns of Japanese heavy cruisers closing from different directions. With suicidal courage and remarkable ship-handling skill, Hathaway steered Heermann directly between battleship Congo and heavy cruisers, crossing both ships' bows at point-blank range in a textbook crossing of the T-maneuver executed in reverse. The Japanese ships, faced with an American destroyer suddenly appearing directly between them at ranges of less than 5,000 yards, were forced to turn hard to avoid collision. In doing so, they masked each other's gunfire and lost track of Heermann in the confusion. The 4 destroyer escorts, designed for anti-submarine warfare and never intended for surface combat against heavy ships, followed the destroyers into battle. At 7:42, Rear Admiral Sprague ordered the destroyer escorts to attack. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland of USS Samuel Roberts decided to act independently rather than wait for clarification. He ordered his ship to follow the destroyers into battle. Samuel Roberts was the smallest of the small boys, displacing only 1,350 tons fully loaded, about the size of a destroyer from the previous war. Copeland had pushed his ship beyond her design limits to keep pace with the larger destroyers, dangerously overpressuring her boilers to 660 pounds per square inch, well beyond the design limit of 440 pounds. The engineering crew maintained this pressure for over an hour, gambling that the boilers would not explode, coaxing 28.7 knots from a ship designed for maximum speed of 24 knots. Before ordering his ship into battle, Copeland addressed his crew over the public address system with words that would become legendary in Navy lore. "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected," he stated matter-of-factly. "We will do what damage we can." The words simply stated the tactical reality every man aboard already understood. They were charging toward heavy cruisers in a ship designed to fight submarines. Their chances of survival were minimal, but their duty was clear. The carriers had to be protected, regardless of cost. At 8:10, Samuel Roberts launched her 3 torpedoes at heavy cruiser Chokai from approximately 4,000 yards, close enough that her 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns could engage Chokai's superstructure directly. Sailors manning the smaller weapons raked the cruiser's upper works with automatic fire, shattering windows and killing exposed personnel. One torpedo struck Chokai's stern engineering spaces, causing catastrophic damage to her propulsion system. Combined with a 500-pound bomb hit from a Taffy 2 aircraft that detonated in her engine room minutes later, Chokai was left dead in the water with uncontrollable flooding. Destroyer Fujinami later scuttled the crippled cruiser with torpedoes. Roberts had achieved what her designers never imagined possible. A destroyer escort had mission-killed a heavy cruiser armed with 8 8-inch guns. Roberts then engaged heavy cruiser Chikuma in an extended gun duel at ranges fluctuating between 5,000 and 7,000 yards. Her 2 5-inch guns fired 608 rounds in 35 minutes, a sustained rate of fire of over 17 rounds per minute per gun, astonishing for manually loaded weapons. The gun crews worked with machine-like precision, loading, firing, and loading again in a rhythm that never slowed, despite Japanese shells exploding all around them. The aft gun mount, designated Mount 52, was commanded by gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, a 24-year-old from Chakota, Oklahoma. Carr's gun crew maintained their incredible rate of fire even after losing electrical power to the mount, manually cranking the turret into position and hand-loading each 54-pound shell into the breech. At approximately 8:50, a Japanese 8-inch shell struck Mount 52, penetrating the thin gun shield and exploding inside the mount. The blast killed or wounded most of the crew instantly, but the gun itself remained functional. Carr, though horribly wounded, refused to abandon his post. At 8:51, disaster struck. A powder charge cooked off in the overheated breech, detonating prematurely as it was being loaded. The explosion destroyed the gun mount completely, shattering the barrel and blowing the breech mechanism apart. Carr was caught directly in the blast, suffering catastrophic wounds described by witnesses as ripping him open from neck to groin. When rescue parties reached Mount 52 after the abandoned ship order, they found Carr dying at his station, still holding the mount's final shell, begging with his last breaths for someone to load it so the gun could keep firing. He died moments later. At 8:51, a Japanese shell struck Samuel Roberts's engineering spaces, penetrating below the waterline and detonating inside the engine room. The explosion destroyed her main engines and generators, creating an inferno. Water flooded in through the hole blown in the hull. Most personnel stationed there died within seconds. The ship's main engines and generators were destroyed. Samuel Roberts lost all power and began flooding rapidly. At 9:09, a second shell struck near the aft 5-inch mount, killing more men. At 9:10, with his ship dead in the water, flooding uncontrollably and sinking, Lieutenant Commander Copeland ordered abandon ship. Samuel Roberts capsized and sank at approximately 10:05. Of her crew of 224 officers and men, 89 were killed in action. An additional 25 died from wounds, exposure, or shark attacks during the 2 days survivors spent in the water. 120 men ultimately survived, many bearing wounds and psychological scars they would carry for life. Throughout these surface actions, American aircraft swarmed over the Japanese ships in continuous attacks that historians would later describe as some of the most courageous flying of the Pacific War. Taffy 3's pilots faced an impossible situation. Their aircraft carried ordnance meant for ground targets, not naval armor. Many Avengers had already expended their torpedoes on pre-dawn strikes against Japanese positions ashore. The Wildcat fighters carried machine guns effective against aircraft but useless against battleship armor. Some pilots attacked with depth charges, cylindrical weapons designed to explode underwater near submarines. Against surface ships, depth charges were nearly worthless, but pilots dropped them anyway, hoping to cause some damage or at least distract Japanese gunners. Yet the pilots pressed home attack after attack with courage bordering on insanity. Young ensigns and lieutenants, many with fewer than 200 hours of total flight time, dove on the most powerful battleships ever built. They made run after run, attacking from different angles, some flying through walls of anti-aircraft fire so thick it seemed impossible to penetrate. When their bombs and torpedoes were gone, they made dry runs, diving at Japanese ships without weapons, forcing enemy commanders to maneuver and spoiling their gunnery. The psychological effect on Japanese commanders proved profound. Vice Admiral Kurita, watching wave after wave of American aircraft attacking his ships, became convinced he faced fleet carriers, not escort carriers. The ferocity and persistence of the air attacks seemed impossible from the small carriers he had been briefed about. Pilots from Taffy 2 joined the battle as word spread. Rear Admiral Felix Stump, commanding Taffy 2, immediately ordered his squadrons rearmed with heavier weapons. Avengers were loaded with torpedoes and 500-pound general-purpose bombs, the heaviest ordnance available. Within 30 minutes of Sprague's initial distress call, Taffy 2 launched strike after strike. Throughout the 90-minute surface battle, Taffy 2 launched 3 full strikes totaling over 70 sorties against Kurita's force. These attacks proved devastating. The concentrated airstrikes sank 3 Japanese heavy cruisers and damaged others, disrupting Japanese command and control throughout the battle. At approximately 8:20, aircraft from Taffy 2 hit heavy cruiser Suzuya with a near miss that detonated her starboard forward torpedo tubes. The torpedoes, each carrying over 1,000 pounds of high explosives, detonated in a chain reaction. The explosions blew massive holes in Suzuya's hull and started uncontrollable fires. Around noon, with fires raging out of control and ammunition beginning to cook off, Suzuya was abandoned. She sank at approximately 13:20. Heavy cruiser Chikuma, already damaged by Samuel Roberts's gunfire, was hit by multiple torpedoes from Taffy 2 aircraft. The torpedoes opened her hull to the sea. Chikuma began sinking slowly, her crew abandoning ship as she settled lower in the water. Destroyer Nowaki took aboard survivors before heading north to rejoin the fleet. Chikuma sank that afternoon. The escort carriers themselves became direct targets as Japanese ships closed range despite the smokescreens and maneuvering. USS Gambia Bay, positioned on the port flank of the carrier formation, fell behind the other carriers as the chase continued. Her engines, stressed beyond their design limits, could not maintain the pace. Captain Walter Viewegg, affectionately known as Uncle Walt by his crew, ordered every possible measure to coax more speed from the labouring machinery. Engineering crews bypassed safety systems and overpressured boilers desperately. But Gambia Bay could not keep up. She fell steadily behind, becoming isolated and vulnerable. The shells began to find the range. At 8:10, Chikuma's shells hit Gambia Bay's after-flight deck, starting fires. More hits followed in rapid succession. At 8:20, a shell penetrated below the waterline near the forward engine room, causing catastrophic flooding. The explosion opened the bulkhead between compartments and seawater rushed in. The forward engine room flooded completely, killing most of the personnel stationed there. Gambia Bay lost the use of one engine. Her speed dropped from 18 knots to 11 knots. She fell further behind, now isolated and defenseless. Johnston, despite her crippled condition, attempted to draw fire away from Gambia Bay. Commander Evans, still commanding from the fantail, ordered his 2 remaining operational guns to engage the Japanese cruisers hammering the carrier. Johnston's shells struck Chikuma and Tone, causing minor damage, but forcing both cruisers to temporarily shift fire. But 3 cruisers firing from close range could not be deterred for long. The cruiser's shells continued to hammer Gambia Bay. Multiple hits struck her engine spaces, her hangar deck, her hull. Fires raged through the riddled carrier. At 8:40, Gambia Bay was dead in the water, listing heavily to port, with fires visible throughout her structure. At 8:50, Captain Vieweg ordered abandon ship. The crew began going over the sides into the warm waters of the Philippine Sea. At 9:07, Gambia Bay capsulated to port. Her keel appeared above the surface, and survivors in the water could clearly see shell holes in her underwater hull. The port propeller was missing, blown off by one of the hits. She remained floating inverted for only 4 minutes. At 9:11, USS Gambia Bay sank, disappearing beneath the surface in less than a minute. From first hit to final sinking, only 61 minutes had elapsed. She was the only American fleet or light carrier sunk by surface gunfire during the Second World War. Of her crew of approximately 800, 147 were killed immediately by shell hits or drowned when the ship sank. Many more would die in the water over the following 2 days. Nearly 700 men went into the water as Gambia Bay sank. They would spend 50 hours floating in shark-infested seas before rescue craft found them. The other carriers suffered heavy damage but remained afloat through desperate maneuvering, smoke screens, and the sacrificial attacks of their escorts. USS Kalinin Bay was hit 15 times by shells ranging from 5 inches to 14 inches caliber. One 14-inch armor-piercing shell from battleship Congo passed completely through the carrier from port to starboard without exploding, the delayed action fuse failing to trigger. The massive projectile left holes 4 feet in diameter in both sides of the ship, but caused surprisingly little damage between entry and exit points. Had it exploded, Kalinin Bay would have been destroyed instantly. Other hits killed and wounded crew members, started fires, and caused flooding, but damage control parties contained the damage. Kalinin Bay survived. USS White Plains sustained multiple near misses and at least 1 direct hit, but her crew kept her engines running and her steering functional. USS Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague's flagship, dodged over 100 near misses through radical maneuvering personally directed by Sprague from the flag bridge. The Admiral's calm voice over the radio, directing his task unit with steady commands despite shells exploding around his ship, helped maintain morale throughout Taffy 3. The carrier's single 5-inch stern gun engaged Japanese cruisers whenever targets came within their 18,000-yard maximum range. The little gun scored hits on several cruisers, causing minor damage to superstructures but nothing approaching critical damage against armoured warships. At approximately 8:45, crippled and surrounded by Japanese destroyers, USS Johnston made her final heroic charge. Commander Evans had observed Japanese light cruiser Yahagi and destroyers forming up for a coordinated torpedo attack on the carriers. Despite having only 1 operational gun turret, 1 barely functional engine producing perhaps 10 knots, and steering controlled by men manually cranking the rudder, Evans turned Johnston toward the 5 enemy ships. It was suicide. and every man aboard knew it. But the carriers had to be protected. Johnston's remaining forward gun fired as fast as the crew could load, scoring hits on Yahagi with several shells. But Japanese destroyers quickly surrounded Johnston, pounding her with gunfire from point-blank range. Shells from 5-inch guns ripped into the already battered destroyer from multiple directions. At 9:10, with all guns silenced, both engines destroyed, fires raging throughout the ship, and the hull listing heavily from uncontrollable flooding, Commander Evans ordered abandon ship. Men began going over the sides, jumping into the warm water and swimming away from the sinking destroyer as fast as they could. At 10:10, USS Johnston rolled over onto her port side and sank rapidly. As she went down, sailors on Japanese destroyer Yukikaze came on deck and stood at attention, saluting the sinking American destroyer in recognition of her crew's extraordinary courage. The gesture, captured in multiple Japanese accounts, reflected the respect Johnston's fight had earned even from her enemies. Commander Ernest Evans was seen abandoning ship, floating in a life jacket, but he was never recovered. Of Johnston's crew of 327 officers and men, only 141 survived. 186 died, either killed in action, drowned when the ship sank, or taken by sharks during the long wait for rescue. Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, becoming the first Native American in the United States Navy to receive the nation's highest decoration for valor. At 9:25, after nearly 2.5 hours of continuous combat, something miraculous occurred. The Japanese attack faltered. Vice Admiral Kurita, his command and control disrupted by aggressive American destroyer attacks, continuous airstrikes, and confusion about what forces he actually faced, ordered his scattered ships to reform and regroup. Communications between Japanese ships had broken down during the chaotic running battle. Individual captains had been making independent decisions, chasing whatever target appeared closest, rather than following a coordinated plan. Kurita feared he was facing the main American carrier force with heavy battleships nearby, ready to trap his force. At 9:25, he ordered a general retirement to the north to consolidate his scattered fleet. What Kurita did not realize was that he had been on the verge of complete and total victory. The American destroyers were sunk or sinking. The destroyer escorts were out of torpedoes, low on ammunition, and crippled. The carriers were damaged, nearly out of fuel and ammunition. Gambier Bay was sinking. The others were damaged and slowing. Another 30 minutes of sustained attack would have destroyed Taffy 3 completely and left Leyte Gulf's invasion beaches utterly defenseless against Japanese battleship fire. Instead, Kurita withdrew. Aboard USS Fanshawe Bay, a signalman standing near Admiral Sprague called out words that captured the surreal moment. "They're getting away," he shouted incredulously. Officers and crew members stared in disbelief as the massive Japanese battleships and cruisers turned northward and began steaming away from the carriers they had been on the verge of destroying. Sprague himself was incredulous. He had been absolutely certain his entire force would be annihilated. His after-action report, filed days later, reflected his amazement at the outcome. The success of Taffy 3 was nothing short of special dispensation from divine providence, Sprague wrote. But there was no time for relief or celebration. At 10:50, even as Taffy 3 recovered from the surface action and rescued survivors from the water, a new threat appeared. 5 Japanese aircraft approached at low altitude from the west, climbed to approximately 2,500 feet, then dove directly toward the carriers. These were not conventional attacks. The pilots had no intention of pulling out of their dives. They were aiming their entire aircraft at American ships. The Divine Wind, the Special Attack Corps, was making its first organized appearance. One Zero fighter crashed into USS Kitcon Bay's port side near the waterline. Its bomb exploded on impact, blowing a hole in the carrier's hull and causing flooding, but the damage was not fatal. Kitcon Bay's crew controlled the flooding and kept the ship operational. Another targeted USS White Plains, but was destroyed by concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The aircraft exploded in mid-air and crashed into the sea short of its target, showering the carrier with debris but causing no significant damage. USS St. Lo was not as fortunate. At 10:53, a Zero fighter piloted by Lieutenant Yukio Seki dove through heavy anti-aircraft fire and crashed through St. Lo's wooden flight deck near the center line. The aircraft's bomb detonated inside the hangar deck, igniting aviation gasoline and armed ordnance waiting to be loaded on aircraft. Secondary explosions tore through the ship as bombs and torpedoes cooked off in the intense heat. Within minutes, flames consumed St. Lo from stem to stern. The fires spread faster than damage control parties could contain them. At 11:25, with fires raging out of control and major explosions occurring every few minutes, Captain Francis McKenna ordered abandon ship. St. Lo exploded in a massive fireball and sank within minutes, the first major American warship sunk by such an attack. Taffy 3 had survived both the surface attack and the aerial strike, but the cost was staggering. 4 ships sunk in combat: USS Johnston, USS Hull, USS Samuel Roberts, USS Gambier Bay. The escort carrier, USS St. Lo, sunk by the new aerial tactic. Multiple other ships damaged, some severely. American casualties totaled 1,161 killed and missing, plus 913 wounded. The survivors who abandoned ship spent up to 50 hours floating in the tropical waters of the Philippine Sea before rescue ships found them. Many men died from wounds, exposure, dehydration, or shark attack while awaiting rescue. The waters off Samar were known to be heavily populated with sharks attracted by the warm water and abundant food sources. Survivors reported seeing sharks constantly during their time in the water. Some men simply disappeared, pulled under by predators. But Taffy 3 had accomplished its mission completely. The invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf remained secure. General MacArthur's 130,000 troops continued landing unopposed by naval gunfire. The Japanese center force, despite its overwhelming superiority in firepower, had been turned back without reaching its objective. Kurita's force continued north after breaking off the attack, hovering in the waters off Samar for several hours while attempting to regroup and assess damage. He changed course multiple times, from due north to west to southwest and back to north again. At approximately 13:10, it became apparent to American observers that Kurita was heading away from Leyte Gulf permanently. He transited back through San Bernardino Strait that night, returning westward toward Brunei. The Battle of Leyte Gulf as a whole was the largest naval battle in history, measured by tonnage of ships engaged, geography covered, and strategic consequences. Over 200,000 personnel participated across an action area of approximately 100,000 square miles of ocean. The Japanese Navy deployed virtually every operational warship remaining in its inventory. The Americans deployed major elements of both 3rd and 7th Fleets. The battle actually consisted of 4 separate major engagements fought over 4 days across 500 miles of ocean. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 26 warships, totaling 306,000 tons displacement. 3 battleships were sunk, 4 carriers were sunk, 10 cruisers were sunk, including 3 off Samar. 9 destroyers were sunk. Over 10,500 Japanese sailors died in the 4-day battle. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again sortie as a major fleet. Fuel shortages, damage to surviving ships, and loss of trained personnel reduced the Navy to a defensive force incapable of strategic offensive operations. The Americans lost 6 ships totaling 37,000 tons. Light carrier USS Princeton was sunk by Japanese air attack on October 24th. 2 escort carriers, USS Gambier Bay and USS St. Lo, were lost off Samar. 2 destroyers, USS Johnston and USS Hull, were sunk off Samar. 1 destroyer escort, USS Samuel Roberts, was sunk off Samar. American casualties totaled 2,803 killed and 913 wounded across all engagements. The strategic victory was complete and decisive. The Japanese Navy had gambled everything on Operation Shogo 1 and lost catastrophically. The Battle off Samar stands apart in naval history for its sheer improbability. Never before or since has such a mismatch in forces resulted in such an outcome. The mathematics were impossible to overcome through conventional analysis. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers against 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The tonnage ratio was approximately 10-1 favouring the Japanese. The gun power ratio was even more lopsided. Yet the smaller force not only survived, but forced the larger force to withdraw without accomplishing its mission. Tactical analysis reveals multiple contributing factors. First, the aggressive American destroyer attacks disrupted Japanese formation integrity at a critical moment. Second, American radar-directed gunnery proved far superior to Japanese optical fire control systems in the conditions that prevailed. The smoke and rain squalls created conditions where American radar gave a decisive advantage. Third, American damage control proved superior, keeping American ships fighting longer despite critical damage. Fourth, Japanese armor-piercing shells designed to penetrate battleship armor over-penetrated the thin hulls of American destroyers and escort carriers, reducing their destructive effect. Fifth, American air attacks maintained continuous pressure throughout the battle, forcing Japanese ships to maneuver constantly and diverting attention from surface targets. But the fundamental factor that explains Taffy 3's survival and victory was human courage and tactical audacity, executed with such ferocity that it convinced the enemy they faced a much more powerful force. Commander Ernest Evans charged toward Yamato without orders because he understood instinctively that aggressive action was the only chance for survival. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland took Samuel Roberts into battle against heavy cruisers, knowing survival was impossible, but attack was necessary. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague ordered his destroyers to conduct suicide torpedo runs because delaying the Japanese advance even briefly might save the carriers. These decisions were not made from positions of strength, they were made from desperation. But they were executed with such complete commitment and ferocity that they convinced Vice Admiral Kurita he faced fleet carriers and heavy units rather than escort carriers and destroyers. The wreckage of the sunken ships remained lost for decades. The Philippine Trench, where the battle occurred,